All right. Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Jessic. I'm the Sexual Assault Response Team and Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Program Manager with MCASA. I think I presented earlier on Wednesday on the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative notification protocol. So if I'm happy to be here again and discuss the neurobiology of trauma. Um, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss and present on. So I'm going to try not to take up the full 2 hours for you, given it's the Friday before a long weekend, it's sunny out and the clear skies. So hoping not to take everyone's full 2 hours, but we'll see. I also, just like in my presentation on Wednesday, really do try and keep an eye on the chat and things like that. So if you have any questions as we go along or you have any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. And of course, I'm sure Alyssa will help me address anything I may miss at the end of the presentation. So I really do, I used to present this presentation in person, and I really do like to have some kind of engagement. I don't have any polls today, but there may be a couple times I ask for input in the chat. So let's dive in. Before we dive into the actual neurobiology of trauma and the structures of the brain and the physical kind of response that may occur when experiencing trauma, we're going to discuss some of the basics. So some of you may be pretty familiar with some of this content at the beginning, but I do feel like it's really important, even if you are already familiar, to revisit and remind yourself of some of this information. So we're going to dive in with just some very basics in terms of what is trauma. And I focus on this at the very beginning because there's a couple things I like to emphasize. Trauma is a normal emotional response to an extremely distressing event. So, when thinking about this definition and what trauma is, there's two things I like to highlight. And the first thing I like to highlight is that the word normal is used here. So, when someone's experiencing trauma, it's not like something they're doing something wrong when they're experiencing trauma symptoms or they kind of withdraw or experience flashbacks. Those are not like abnormal things for someone to experience after experiencing trauma. So it's normal. And I think as advocates or any service provider working in this field, it's important for us to recognize that these responses are normal and to convey that to the survivors we work with when it's appropriate. Because sometimes survivors question the way they're reacting, the things that they did when the trauma was occurring, just like our society does, because victim blaming can be so ingrained in us. And so I think it's really helpful to remind people that these responses are normal. The other thing that I always like to reference is the phrase extremely distressing event in this definition. And we'll dive into a little bit of like what type of events can lead to trauma, but an extremely distressing event, if I ask for the definition, usually an audience starts giving me examples of an extremely distressing event. It can be hard to define, and when we do define it, it is subjective because what is extremely distressing to you may not be extremely distressing to me. And, I was thinking about this the other night about different types of what's upsetting to individuals. And so, a fender bender may be extremely distressing to one individual, and to another individual, it's not very distressing at all. And that's just the difference in the human being. So it's important also to recognize that with survivors of sexual assault, um, working with direct services, there are often times where survivors may say things like, well, I didn't think it was that bad, or I didn't report because it wasn't rape, or they tend to catastrophize or feel like, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, so I didn't say anything at first. And the important thing to recognize there is it's all a form of trauma and sexual violence, and none of it should have occurred. So, reminding survivors of that can be helpful again in helping validate their experience. Um, and again, it doesn't matter how not bad it was, it is still a distressing event and can be traumatic. So, those are things I recommend keeping in mind. So, like I said, about extremely distressing event. What are some events that you would consider extremely distressing or that could lead to trauma? If you can put some thoughts in the chat, I'll give it a couple of seconds. Okay. Loss, witnessing a death, shooting, death, sexual assault, divorce. I've never heard that one before, but yeah, divorce, substance abuse in the family, kidnapping. Yeah. These are all events that can lead to trauma. And of course, why we're here today is because we're discussing sexual assault, and that is of course a traumatic event. But again, I'm just highlighting the varying range of types of trauma. And again, what may be extremely distressing or traumatic to one individual may not be traumatic to another. But again, we're here today to talk about sexual assault and rape and how the trauma can manifest and demonstrate um, when we're working with those survivors. So when we're talking about all these different experiences, we're talking about ACEs, abandonment, death in the family, car accident, divorce, and these traumatic incidents, including rape and sexual assault. How do you expect or think somebody would behave when after they've experienced that? Again, open to the chat is open for your input. Withdrawn, isolated, numb, guarded and angry, maybe irrationally, yeah. Substance abuse, defensive. Yeah, so we're really take their hurt out on someone else. That's definitely possible. So you guys are great. Thank you for all your participation. I could sit here and read through these for a while. But these are all excellent thoughts. Self-loathing and blaming of the self. These are all things that somebody may experience after experiencing trauma. But the thing that I want to highlight is that also, some people may not demonstrate or have trauma symptoms like that. Sometimes people may continue to act completely normally. Sometimes people may even, I've heard of advocates or nurses saying, somebody comes in for the exam and they're laughing and they're joking around and they seem completely fine. And that's because the way somebody reacts to trauma or behaves after a trauma ranges. It's a spectrum. And one day they may seem completely fine, and then the next, they're experiencing trauma symptoms like being withdrawn, low self-esteem. Maybe they're engaging in self-destructive behaviors like substance abuse or self-harm. So the range and the reaction we see from survivors can vary. And we're going to talk about a statistic a little later on about how many survivors actually demonstrate or I don't know if demonstrates the right word, but they experience symptoms of trauma like we're outlining here. But that's the important piece is that just because somebody may not be behaving in the manner that we think they should, they may seem like they're going about their day completely normally, their lives completely normally and seem unaffected. They may be laughing or joking around when they report to somebody. These can all be some coping mechanisms and they're all valid experiences of trauma. So just because somebody is upset doesn't mean, oh, this person, definitely this was traumatic for them. But then somebody that's not crying, oh, they must not have experienced this. They must be lying. That's just not the case. And again, we'll talk a little bit about um, how frequently how frequently symptoms of trauma are shown in individuals after a sexual assault. So again, you all highlighted a number of different things in relation to trauma symptoms. I want to talk about the trauma symptoms and the post-traumatic stress disorder a little bit here. I want to note a couple things. One, referencing the DSM-5 and the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder as outlined in the DSM. So this is a diagnostic tool. So just because somebody may not fit into these boxes as outlined in the diagnostic tool doesn't mean they're not experiencing trauma. I'm just using it as a point of reference and information. So the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder is when somebody has experienced direct or indirect exposure to a traumatic event or repeated exposure to elements of traumatic events. So, couple words again, just like I highlighted with the definition of trauma, I want to highlight here. One, direct or indirect. So this means that, and of course, I think as advocates, we're all familiar with it, but a child that witnesses abuse between their parents or intimate partner violence between their parents, that may be indirect exposure. It's not occurring to them, they are witnessing it. Versus direct exposure as to actually being one of the survivors or victims of the traumatic event. The note here is that this includes the work that we do. Whatever service provider you are, an advocate, a forensic nurse, a prosecutor, law enforcement, whatever it may be, our role is to every day be exposed indirectly to traumatic events and elements of traumatic events. So it's just something to keep in mind. I know a lot of people probably get the lecture on self-care all the time, but there is a lot of trainings on self-care and vicarious trauma because it's a real thing. And so when we're constantly hearing these stories and working with the survivors, it can really lead to symptoms of trauma within ourselves. So something to be mindful of. The other thing I highlight here is that the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder says a person must be exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. And again, the words I want to highlight here is actual or threatened. And I think, especially after Tony's presentation yesterday, the power and control wheel, those threats of violence, those threats of, I have the power and control over you and can harm you and do this to you at any time, whether that's actually occurring or not, is also a traumatic event. And it's something that can also result in trauma symptoms. So, with that being said, I'm going to dive into the actual types of trauma symptoms. This is not a complete list. There are other trauma symptoms individuals may experience, but again, we're looking at the DSM in these kind of broad categories. So, as some of you said, re-experiencing of the event. This is kind of what we, I think, as in modern day culture refer to as flashbacks. So this can be in the form of nightmares. This can be in the form of, sitting at their desk and someone says something or a certain song comes on or someone references something that is a trigger, and they can be brought back to these experiences where they feel and are reliving what happened to them in that moment. We also have avoidance behaviors. And so avoidance behaviors is avoiding things where someone's safety feels jeopardized or avoiding reminders of the trauma. So you may wonder why these images are on your screen, but the example I often give, especially when talking to college campus staff and Title IX staff, is something like a student may take a direct walk from point A to point B to get to their class, but then they are assaulted one day over the weekend or whatever, and they end up being late for class. And that looks like maybe they're purposely being late or they're struggling, but it may be something as simple as on their normal walk to class, they pass the perpetrator and they don't want to pass them anymore. So they start taking a longer route, which results in them being late. So those types of avoidance behaviors, avoidance of the perpetrator, avoidance of reminders of the event, those are definitely some trauma symptoms that are often demonstrated. We also have isolation, which I know a lot of people put in isolation and withdrawn in the chat as a trauma symptom. And that's definitely something people stop engaging in the activities that they used to enjoy. So they may stop going out with friends. They may stop engaging in certain hobbies. They may have been a runner or something and they stop engaging it. May not necessarily be an avoidance behavior because of a reminder or something, but they may just no longer have that motivation or desire to continue to engage in those types of things that they used to engage in. Negative thoughts or feelings. I think this is also demonstrated by people in the chat, noting like low self-esteem, self-destruction, I don't know, like self-loathing and blame. So survivors of trauma and sexual assault are going to often have those experiences and those thoughts and feelings about themselves. I personally think part of that is part of the victim blaming culture that our society like is so ingrained in many of us. And I think survivors even start to question the same things that sometimes our society questions of them. And so they feel like they're at fault. I think we hear stories, and I think even in Leah's story that was shared at the end of Wednesday's presentation, survivors will blame themselves. Like, I let him in my home, or I went over to his place, or I went out to dinner with him and let him pay, or she, picked me up and gave me a ride. So those different things can then result in blame and those negative thoughts or feelings as well. So now I'm going to dive into some of the statistics I said I was going to discuss. So I think this is, again, something important for us to recognize as advocates or service providers and be able to convey to survivors who may question what they're experiencing and their trauma symptoms. So, and also some of these are very thought-provoking. So off the bat, if we look at the United States population as a whole, 100% of the US, of that 100%, 7.8% will be diagnosed with PTSD at some point in their lifetime. So this isn't even accounting for people that may not qualify because they don't check all the boxes for the diagnosis, or may not even see a provider that could diagnose them. So this is a somewhat limited sample, but 7.8% of the US population checks all the boxes for PTSD and, sees a provider for that diagnosis will be diagnosed with PTSD at some point in their lifetime. So this is looking at, veterans, survivors of natural disasters, first responders. We're looking at the entire population. But when we dive into looking at that 7.8%, 31% of them are sexual assault survivors. So, no, that's not like 50% of all individuals diagnosed with PTSD are sexual assault survivors. But when we think about the number of different incidents that can result in trauma and PTSD, that's a really big chunk. So, sexual assault is a truly, and I don't think anyone would argue this, traumatic experience that can have a long lasting effect on the survivors. And I think that's something to be aware of. The other thing that I promised I would discuss, and I think is a fascinating statistic, is that 94% of women experience symptoms of trauma 2 weeks after a sexual assault. So I don't know if you want to put in the chat about anyone finding anything interesting about that statistic, but what I find interesting is that 94%, that's pretty high, but we're talking about a 2 week period. We're not talking about within 24 hours, within 48 hours, or even within 1 week. We're saying 94% of female sexual assault survivors experience trauma symptoms within 2 weeks. So that demonstrates that trauma symptoms may not set in right away for some individuals. And so when they're reporting to the police, or they're talking to law enforcement, or telling a friend or an advocate, they may not be demonstrating those symptoms. And again, it's not a sign that the trauma didn't happen or it wasn't traumatic to them, but they just may not be demonstrating those symptoms yet. It also indicates that, if my math is correct, which I think this is an easy number, 6% of those survivors will not show any trauma symptoms, even at the 2 week mark. So I think that's really a good reminder for us as responders. And I'm not saying I think anyone would not believe a survivor based on their behavior, but just demonstrating that the way somebody behaves is not an indication of whether or not trauma occurred or they're experiencing trauma symptoms. And so again, I think that's important to remember, and that 6%, they may never experience trauma symptoms. So, or it may take years for the onset of those experiences or those symptoms to come on. So something to keep in mind. I will note, because I have been asked before and I just have not been successful, is this is a number in relation to women and women survivors of assault. So I've tried looking into numbers specific to men or just generally the population. I haven't found anything, but I haven't looked in a little while, so maybe worth taking a look again. But that is just something I want to highlight, that is speaking to women. So Next, as we're talking about, trauma symptoms and demonstration of trauma symptoms doesn't necessarily mean an assault did or did not occur. I do want to ask kind of what everyone's thoughts are about false reports. What is your understanding about, are they common? Do you have thoughts on like the percentage in which reports are actually false when we're talking about sexual assault? So I'm going to give it a couple seconds here if you want to put in the chat your thoughts or beliefs. 4 to 7% are false reports. Okay. Anyone else? All right. So Danielle, same as any other crime, yes. So Danielle's comment on 4 to 7% it is wrong and affects the lives of people. Yes, it does. Okay. So thanks for that input. I will highlight that um, I think as a society, and Danielle, you kind of hit the nail on the head with 4 to 7% are false reports. And Victoria, you also said same as any other crime. So yes, it is the statistics of actual false reports for sexual assault are the same of false reports for any other crime. There's no real varying difference there. And I do see the note about it being wrong and affecting the lives of other people. I don't want to discredit that and definitely agree that false reporting is wrong and incorrect and affects other people's lives. So I don't want to breeze over that. But I do want to highlight that in our society, I think there is a shift. But I have been in these presentations where people say 50% of reports are false. Even in one of our cases recently, law enforcement sat down with the survivor and said 90% of women lie about being sexually assaulted. You just happen to be in the 10% who didn't. So there is this belief about false reports, and I think we're moving in the right direction. But I think it's important for us for those of us working with the survivors to recognize where that belief comes from. And so when we're looking at the left side of your screen, that 40% bar on the graph, that is kind of the foundation of where the beliefs on false reports started. And that came from a study by Eugene Kainan. It was conducted in like the 90s or the late 80s. So Eugene Kainan, he did this study on false reports. He decided he wanted to look into the research on how many sexual assault reports are false. And he went to a law enforcement agency and he said, I want to look at your cases. I want to look at all of them and review them, and we're going to figure out how many are false. So they reviewed the cases and then they approached each of the survivors and they said, hey, we want to interview you. We want to go over this. We're going to give you a polygraph to see if you're lying about this. And oh, by the way, if we determine you are lying, we are going to charge you with false reporting. And so one, polygraphs are not valid, and they're not acceptable in court anyways, and it is illegal in Maryland to use a polygraph on a victim of sexual assault. We also saw that in that study, a lot of survivors disengaged. So just off the bat, like, no, no, thank you, I'm not going to participate. We're not going to do this. And when someone did say that, they counted it as a false report. So we ended up with this high number of over 40% of sexual assault claims are false. Additionally, when we look at that study, it cannot be recreated. So a lot of researchers really kind of noticed that they can't recreate that study because Eugene Kainan didn't say what law enforcement agency he worked with. So nobody knows if it's urban, nobody knows if it's suburban or rural. There's no real understanding of the work that he did to get those numbers. So that study cannot be created. And the studies that have been created since and that are accepted research and are deemed valid suggest that it's about 3 to 7% of reports are actually false. So it's a very low number. And again, I always like to highlight that we can't make a determination on if somebody's report is false based on their trauma symptoms or how they're behaving after the incident, because that's just not an indicator of something. So it's always, I think, our role as advocates to approach the situation believing the survivor. It's not our job to investigate. That's law enforcement role. So whatever we can do to help the survivor, and recognizing that the numbers of false reports are actually really low. So now we're going to get into the fun part, in my opinion, in the neurobiology of trauma, the structures involved in the brain, and behaviors that somebody may demonstrate when experiencing a traumatic event. So the first thing that I have is a video I want to show you all. It's an excellent video if somebody ever says to you, hey, I'm curious about the neurobiology of trauma, and I only have 10 minutes. Show them this video. It is very thorough and an excellent at giving an understanding of it. I'll note a couple things. The accents are Scottish, so I'm going to put on closed captions, but they can be a little bit hard to understand, and even the captions kind of get the wording wrong occasionally. So I do apologize for that. It's still an excellent video. Again, it's about 10 minutes long, and then kind of gives a great overview, and we'll dive into it a little bit further once the video wraps up.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later, but in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression? Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress?
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean, in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. I can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move, or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with our feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
Okay. So again, I think that that video is an excellent, high-level overview of the neurobiology of trauma. We're going to dive into it a little bit further here and a little bit more in depth. Before we do that, I know I said we're going to do that, but before we do that, I want to note two things that were mentioned in the video. The first, they mentioned the US military developed interviewing techniques, and that's actually referencing what is referred to as FETI, or the Forensic Experiential Trauma Interviewing. This type of interviewing, excuse me, was developed by Russell Strand. He was US military police, now retired, but he developed this interviewing technique. And some of the highlights about the technique are to begin by approaching with genuine empathy. So when I think about this, I kind of think about End Violence Against Women International's campaign called Start by Believing. So approaching somebody in their initial report with empathy and belief. And so this may begin by starting something like the conversation with, I'm really sorry that this happened to you, or I'm really sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, something along those lines, just to acknowledge and validate the person's experience. And then again, excuse me, listen to what the survivor has to say. So you're acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and then using our understanding of the neurobiology of trauma to interview in a way that better helps the survivor recall information. So law enforcement typically is trained to ask the questions like who, what, when, where, and to kind of get things in a chronological order. That is, they're not doing anything wrong. That's the nature of, what they're trained for. But when talking about trauma incidents like rape and sexual assault, memories, like we saw in the video, and we'll explore a little bit further, are not stored the same way. So they're harder to retrieve. So trying to relay something chronological may be very difficult for the survivor, and it may make an appearance that they're making something up or that they don't remember or something along those lines, when in actuality, they're having trouble recalling the information because of what's happening in the brain during trauma. And certain types of information is better encoded into our memory than others. It's important, and FETI acknowledges that we should be asking questions about the information that is better encoded and expanding from there. So we know through the neurobiology of trauma that chronological narrative type of information isn't stored as well as things like sensations, pleasure and pain and sound and smell. So when we start by asking the questions about those sensations, then we can try and build and hopefully gather more information that can obtain a narrative as we move along. So this is FETI. I will also say that when I've spoken about FETI to law enforcement, I get a lot of questions about, well, like, I can't start by believing. I can't, approach a survivor that's reporting something like this and say, I'm sorry this happened to you. And I understand the argument, but we can still approach with empathy. And the idea isn't to say like, oh, I believe you and I'm not going to do an investigation. That's my job. The idea is to build rapport with the survivor off the bat. And once that rapport is built, the investigation and the interviewing becomes easier for the detective. So it allows the detective to get to the end result easier in a less traumatic way for survivors, and regardless of what that conclusion is. The other thing that I'll note, and I'm not going to go to the next slide yet because I don't know if everything's going to show up, but this is a very interesting point. So, okay, I'll just go to the next slide. So the other thing that I want to highlight is the International Association of Chiefs of Police guidance to law enforcement agencies across the country on what their policy and protocol should be when there's an officer-involved shooting. And this may seem irrelevant, but I have a point, is that when I say officer-involved shooting, I mean an officer involved in the shooting of a civilian. So the IACP recommends that agencies have policies that allow for the officer to be immediately transported to a safe and supportive environment, to have access to someone that has privileged communication, so essentially like an advocate, a confidential community-based advocate, and to be given one sleep cycle before they are like giving an in-depth interview. And the reason I highlight this is not to bash law enforcement or anything, but this policy is based on an understanding of the neurobiology of trauma and what's going on in the brain, and the best way for somebody that's involved in a stressful traumatic event to better recall information and provide that information in an interview setting. And so that is why these policies kind of recommend those elements. And so I think that it's important for us to recognize that survivors of a traumatic event, whether that be sexual assault or rape or something else, also deserve those types of care and considerations. So, they deserve the ability to have access to a confidential advocate, an advocate with law enforcement or an advocate with a state's attorney's office. They're not confidential. They have every obligation to disclose anything that the survivor says to law enforcement. Community-based advocates with the Rape Crisis Center, they're confidential. They can talk to the survivor and they're not forced to disclose information. Being transported to a safe and supportive environment immediately. I've heard of cases where survivors reported an assault and then immediately law enforcement took them back to the scene and had them retell their story in that setting. That's not going to be very trauma informed for the survivor. And also the one sleep cycle. This is something that allows for the information about the assault to be stored into the brain and easier to recall. Now, I'm not saying law enforcement or anyone shouldn't get any information off the bat when first reported, because there could be the need to locate the suspect and detain the suspect. There could be threats to the safety of the community, further threats to the survivor. So there are things that have to be weighed here. But generally speaking, an in-depth interview, so going beyond just the basic facts that may be necessary for those initial steps to take place in an investigation, that can happen at least one sleep cycle after the incident. So again, I just think it's important to note that the things that we're asking for survivors, this type of access to an advocate, ability to sleep and have a safe environment, that's not so outside of the norm. It is recognized as something that's appropriate after a traumatic event. So now we'll go into the neurobiology of trauma. So there was a couple parts of the brain that were referenced in that video that I'm going to dive into a little bit further today. And so the first that I want to start with are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So the prefrontal cortex is the front portion of your brain. It's responsible for executive functioning. So it's responsible for, your planning of the day. This training starts at 10 a.m. I also have to, finish writing a report before that. So I need to make sure that I am up by 8:30 and starting to write my report by 9. So then I have a moment, you're able to plan out your day, your time, your goals. It's all your normal thoughts and functions. That's all happening at the prefrontal cortex. So it should ideally always be functional. You had those thoughts to plan out your day. Maybe you're thinking ahead to the weekend. Hopefully it's a long weekend for everybody, but you're planning out, the things that you need to take care of. That's your prefrontal cortex at its peak functioning. Then you also have the amygdala. The amygdala is small section of the brain in the center, core of your brain, and it is also constantly active. It is actually responsible for scanning the environment for threats. It's kind of what we saw in the video was like that alarm bell going off. So again, it's constantly active. It is ideally quiet for most of the time. So like right now, hopefully your prefrontal cortex is operating at peak performance. You're taking notes, you're following this presentation, you're absorbing the information, and your amygdala is pretty quiet. It's not distracting, but maybe if somebody walks behind you or comes up behind you and taps your shoulder quickly and you didn't realize, your amygdala might kind of pop open an alarm bell and say, wait, what was that? And you can assess the situation and there's no threat. So then you move on, the amygdala quiets down again, and you're able to focus again on this presentation. That's our ideal operation of things, right? When the amygdala goes off and that alarm bell kind of sounds, the brain actually starts to shut down the prefrontal cortex because your brain is shifting to focusing on, is there a threat to me? And if there is a threat to me, what do I need to do? So an example I always give is, if somebody's at a bar or something and their friends go home, but they decide to stay a little longer, and there's somebody there who's saying, hey, take some shots with me, take some shots with me. And they're like, no, I don't want any shots. I don't do shots. I don't drink hard liquor, whatever it may be. But the person continues pressing, and then eventually, they take the hint and walk away and sit by themselves at the bar. But the amygdala should be kind of sounding an alarm where, yeah, they walked away, the threat may be a little bit less, but you kind of keep an eye on them out of the corner of your eye. And they notice that when they ask for the check, that person also asks for their check. When they start to put the coat on, that person also puts their coat on. So as these things are happening, that amygdala alarm bell is getting louder and louder. And the ideal scenario is that the prefrontal cortex would kick in and help create a plan of action. So maybe you ask for the manager of the bar to wait outside for your Uber to arrive, so you're not alone. You may call a friend and say, hey, I'm heading home. I'm getting in the Uber. I should be there in X amount of time. Things like that. That's your prefrontal cortex operating. But unfortunately, oftentimes when the amygdala sounds, again, the prefrontal cortex starts to shut down because your brain's focusing on your environment and threats a little bit more. So that that normal thought and planning isn't necessarily occurring. So now we're going to dive into what happens when the prefrontal cortex shuts down and that planning can't take place. And so when this happens, the HPA axis kicks in. And the HPA axis refers to the hypothalamus, which is a structure in the brain, and then the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland. So this axis is a series of, communication between these structures. And so it starts with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is often referred to as Grand Central Station of the brain. All trains go through Grand Central Station. So all information is coming in through the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus is directing the trains or the information where it needs to go. So when that amygdala is sounding and it's saying, hey, there's possibly a threat, the hypothalamus gets that message and then sends a message to the pituitary gland that there's a threat. The pituitary gland, also a structure in the brain, is called the master gland. So it's responsible for providing instructions to all other glands in the body. So the hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary gland that, hey, there's a threat to our well-being. We need to kick into action. And the pituitary gland sends a message to the adrenal gland to release a flood of hormones into the body as a response to potential trauma. So the idea is that these hormones are going to increase our likelihood of survival. And the adrenal gland releases a series of stress hormones. This is not the end-all be-all of the stress hormones, but I'm going to talk about I call it the cocktail, for lack of a better word, of these hormones. So first, you have your catecholamines. So that's like your adrenaline. That's being released into the body to help with fight or flight, to help you jump into action, whatever that action may be, as a means of protecting yourself. You also have cortisol, which we heard about in the video. That is often referred to the stress hormone. So, when I'm extremely stressed or whatever, I often, blame it on cortisol, but cortisol is our stress hormone. So that's going to increase because we're in a stressful situation. And that's also going to increase our energy levels, helping with fight or flight. The last two that I want to mention, first is opiates. I have had to clarify, this is not heroin being released into the body. This is a natural opiate in our body to help blunt physical pain. So you heard in the video the example of a man carrying his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain. We've all heard those crazy horror stories where somebody, was severely injured, but they were able to survive and get help and do an X, Y, and Z. That's with the help of some opiates, helping blunt the pain so the brain isn't processing it, so that you can continue to do what's necessary to survive. Because if you would feel that pain, you may not be able to walk a mile. So it's kind of that natural painkiller. The next thing I want to note is oxytocin, which I'm gonna, if anyone has any thoughts in the chat about when there's 3 or 4 other incidents when oxytocin is released into the body naturally. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or they know when oxytocin is released. Feel free to put that in the chat. But when I first started learning about the neurobiology of trauma, I was like, wait a second, oxytocin creates positive feelings. So why would it be released during a traumatic event? And so I really had to like dig into it and kind of wrap my head around it. But essentially, oxytocin is released to help with positive feelings. So the natural times it's released is giving birth, a mother giving birth and breastfeeding with her child. So, my mom always told me when I was born, I was upside down and the cord was around my neck, and she was in labor for a very long period of time. And I don't know if I actually was that much of a pain. I like to think that I wasn't, but apparently I was. And yet, after all of that pain and those hours of labor, she was able to bond with me and, create and care for me. So that's the oxytocin kicking in. Extreme pain, the opiates are helping possibly blunt that, and oxytocin is allowing the mother and the child to bond. There are theories that mothers that are releasing less oxytocin during delivery are more likely to be diagnosed and experience with postpartum depression. Oxytocin's also released like when we engage with animals. So yeah, body to body contact. I'm just going to get to that. So when working with or touching our animals, like your dog or your cat, I'm obsessed with my cats. They help us release oxytocin. That's why they are a good stress way to help manage stress is engage with animals. And then also body to body contact. So like I said, the breastfeeding, other forms of body to body contact, you can help get positive feelings in sports, but then also consensual sex. So it allows you to build that relationship with your consensual partner. So again, I had to sit down and say, well, why would it be released? That doesn't make sense based on survival. Why would it be released during an event like a rape or sexual assault? And the research actually suggests that it's meant to be an emotional opiate. So to help blunt the pain of the emotions of being violated and harmed in this way so that you can survive the event that's happening to you. There's also some theories though that the more oxytocin somebody has released during a traumatic event is when we start to see things like Stockholm syndrome occur, because that oxytocin was released at a higher level, creating that bond with the perpetrator. That's not really studied because we can't really study that. That would be unethical, but there are some theories on that. So I do find that very interesting and something to keep in mind, especially when I know I can't scientifically say that if somebody's laughing after an assault or joking around with law enforcement and the nurses, that it's the oxytocin. But I can say that all of these stress hormones flooding the body can have a variety of different effects that we may not be able to understand. So it may be part of the reason why somebody is reacting or behaving the way they are after an assault or a trauma event. The other thing that I want to note, unfortunately, is that when these hormones flood the body, the prefrontal cortex is further shut down. So we have continuation of planning and high level thinking, the inhibition of that. So I think Rebecca Campbell, who she's cited at the bottom of the screen, she's a neuro researcher out of University of Michigan. She kind of describes it as when the prefrontal cortex shuts down, our ability to think if this, then that is shut down. So if this happens, then I will do X, shuts down. So that's when we get those victim blaming behaviors of, well, you were at a party. Why didn't you just scream? Why didn't you run out of the room for other people? Well, when the prefrontal cortex is shut down, again, that if this, then I will yell is inhibited. So people aren't able to have those thought process that may seem completely normal and natural for us. Additionally, with the prefrontal cortex shut down, we need to rely on learned behavior. So everybody experiences this trauma response. It's not like, oh, there's some outliers and their prefrontal cortex remains up and running fully during a traumatic event. We all experience it when we experience trauma. But if we have learned behavior, the idea is the learned behavior will override that trauma response and we can jump into action. So this is why you see like military, first responders, like law enforcement, EMS, firefighters, they go through rigorous training when they start their job. And the idea they go through different scenarios of if this happens, then you do X, Y, and Z. And that training, that constantly going through that, the hope is that if something does happen, then those learned behaviors will override the trauma response that's occurring in the body and they'll jump into the appropriate action. But two things doesn't always work. We all hear stories, and I was trying to think of like movies or TV shows where they show like war and somebody freezing and they're not able to respond. It happens. So the learned behavior isn't foolproof. The other thing, we should not have to have learned behavior in terms of how to respond if we're experiencing trauma like sexual assault. It's simply not possible. It's not feasible. And I could go on a tangent about how we need to explain how raping somebody or sexually assaulting somebody is wrong and not teach people how to respond. So that the response of that learned behavior isn't ingrained. So again, when somebody's experiencing that trauma, this system, the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the HPA axis really hinders their ability to engage in what we may consider normal or beneficial responses to trauma. So now I'm going to dive a little bit into memory. So the hippocampus is responsible for memory. And when all of this is happening in the brain, again, the prefrontal cortex is shutting down because the amygdala is going off and the HPA axis is flooding the body with hormones to help you survive. The prefrontal cortex is shutting down, and so is your memory storage. So in the video, I think they were showing like papers going into files. And so that's kind of how I, excuse me, picture this is our memory is this, huge file room. And ideally, if somebody asks you, what did you have for breakfast on February 13th, 2025, mentally, your brain can go to the right filing cabinet for breakfast for this week, for this day, and pull out the information and provide it to you. So they'll be like, oh, I had a yogurt parfait, whatever it may be. That's the ideal operation of your memory. The files are being put in the correct filing cabinet, in the correct drawer, in the correct folder. But when trauma is happening, and again, all these things are happening in the brain and body, that stops. It doesn't mean the memories aren't being formed. It just means they aren't being filed correctly. So the memories are still there, but you may not be able to access them as easily as you would other memories. And this is when we're talking about super encoding versus minimal encoding. So during a traumatic event, some information is super encoded and some information is minimally encoded. And it would be great, wouldn't it, if our brains super encoded all the information that like law enforcement would ask for, who, what, when, where, why. But unfortunately, again, our brain is focusing on survival. So what is often super encoded are details that aren't central to like an investigation. So sometimes you may hear of somebody like being able to describe in perfect detail the decorations in the room where it occurred or the apartment, but they can't tell you what time they got to the apartment. Like we saw in that video, they can't tell you where the apartment is located. And part of that is because once the brain recognizes that there's a threat, our brain starts to super encode signals that could later tell us of danger. So the idea is that, okay, there's a picture on the wall that it depicts X, Y, and Z. The next time you see that picture, it could also be a trigger of one, I'm possibly in danger, and two, for flashbacks. So again, in that video, they were trying to convey in the child sexual abuse case that the color green, because the individual was wearing a green tie, was a trigger to somebody. So it's like the green, the color green in the green tie was super encoded. And so the next time they see the color green, it sends a signal to the brain and the body that, hey, there's possibly a threat to us, even though that may not necessarily be the case. So we start to get information that's less accessible, but more important if we're talking about an investigation. Again, the memories are accurate but difficult to retrieve. So they're still being formed. They're just hard to find and locate in the correct files. And I think that Rebecca Campbell, once again, I'll give an example she gives, does a great example with memory to really kind of convey what's happening is, let's say, you were coming to this training, and your boss said to you, here's a bunch of sticky notes, different colors, different sizes. I want you to take notes of this presentation on these sticky notes. And then I want you to crumple them up and I want you to hide them all around your desk. Like toss them in drawers, toss them in your cups, toss them under your laptop, whatever it may be. So, and then I want you to the next day come back and put the presentation back together in chronological order. Well, for some of us, that's going to be pretty easy. We may have a very organized desk, and I don't know if our associate director, she might kill me if she's on this call, but I remember when we worked in the office, her desk was it was a mess. It was stressful for me to look at. And so I feel like if this task was given to her, it might take her a little longer to put together the presentation in chronological order. Could she do it? Possibly. Would it take her more time than me, who's a little bit more structured on my desk? Probably. That doesn't mean one of us attended the presentation more and the other didn't. Additionally, all of our notes are going to look different. So I was one of those students in school. I was really annoying. I would take my notes in class and then I'd go home and I'd rewrite my notes so they looked better. So I took very, very detailed notes. So my notes may be very detailed on the sticky notes, a lot of information on one, while another person's might just say hippocampus equals memory, and that's it. Again, it doesn't mean one of us attended the training and one of us didn't. It just means that we're storing the information differently, and one of us may be able to put together that presentation better and in chronological order faster than the other one. And so the reason I give this example is also because that's what we're asking a survivor to do when we ask them to retell their story. They're trying to put together sticky notes that are in the wrong place. They're crumpled up. They're different colors. They're different types of notes. And so they're not only trying to put them together in order, they're trying to then decipher the information that's on it. So if there's not much detail available, if it just says hippocampus memory, it may take them a little while to be like, okay, what was this about? And provide you with the information. So that's kind of I feel like it kind of downplays what survivors experience, but this is kind of like what they experience when they're asked to recall what happened to them. The other thing that I'll just note is alcohol, just because alcohol can worsen encoding and memory storage, but it doesn't stop it altogether. So just because somebody was drinking or under the influence doesn't mean they won't be able to recall information. However, if we start talking about date rape drugs like Rohypnol or GHB, those are going to shut down those memories altogether. And so they won't be able to recall anything because the memories were never formed. So things to keep in mind when talking to survivors about what happened to them. So now that we've been through what's happening with the body and how the brain's communicating to the body that there may be a threat, let's talk about what the kind of behavior in the body might do to help encourage survival. So I keep doing this, but before we go into that, I do want to touch on some emerging terminology around the response to trauma and things like sexual assault and rape. So for many of us, you may already be familiar with terms fight or flight. You may also be familiar with additional terms that are often tacked onto that, like freeze, faint, and fawn. So these have been historically used to convey different responses that somebody may engage in when experiencing a traumatic event. Recently, though, Dr. Jim Hopper, another researcher, and Violence Against Women International have suggested shifting from using the term fight, flight, freeze, faint, fawn to habits and reflexes. So it's their belief, and there is some information out there, very detailed, that these terms more accurately represent the physiology behind responses to trauma. So as you can see on this slide, I broke down kind of the fight, flight, freeze response into their categories of survival mode, habits, and reflexes. So today I'm still going to discuss fight, flight, or freeze and the responses that you see written out on the screen. I'm not going to say that it's incorrect to think of these responses of habits and reflexes, but personally, I do think that that can be dangerous because to me, habits and reflexes suggest that if you don't respond correctly, then you have bad habits or incorrect reflexes. So to me, and in my opinion, that puts the onus back on the survivor of, oh, you didn't engage in the right habit when this happened to you. And it can be very blaming or victim blaming. When in contrast, I think fight, flight, or freeze can be explained at an evolutionarily level as to why those things are possibly occurring when someone experiences trauma. If anyone's interested in more information about the idea of habits and reflexes, I'm happy to provide some of those resources. But again, we're going to focus on the fight, flight, or freeze response today. So when looking at fight, flight, or freeze, we're referring to what is known as a defense cascade. So the defense cascade is the different manners that somebody may engage in when experiencing threat or trauma. So this is a cascade of responses that may or may not occur. So just because you're seeing it on the screen doesn't mean it's always going to occur. It doesn't mean that every single one will occur, and it doesn't necessarily mean that just because somebody froze the first time they were assaulted doesn't mean they're going to freeze the second time. It is a cascade, and you can move through that cascade during the same traumatic event or during different traumatic events. So we're going to start with talking about the order is out of, sorry, my slides are out of order, but we're going to start by talking about the tend and befriend. So the beginning far left of that defense cascade. So these are also sometimes referred to as self-protection habits, and they're behaviors that we have all ingrained in us to kind of politely decline some advances. They're non-confrontational responses. They're meant so that we don't upset the other individual. We don't quote unquote cause a scene, but we are saying we're not interested. And these behaviors we do across all types of social interactions. So, of course, today we're talking about in sexual advances, but these are things, you may have a coworker. I always think of Office Space and coworker who's taking your stapler all the time. You may be having those polite conversations where you're not trying to upset them, you're not trying to cause a confrontation or a scene in the office, but you are also trying to tell them like, hey, give me my stapler back. So these are things that we engage in across all social interactions. Today, what we're talking about is when somebody is making a sexual advance towards another individual, and say, they're at the bar and somebody's again wanting them to take shots, telling them to come home with them, to spend the night, whatever. These are different responses somebody may have to that. So they may say like, my partner will be mad, or I don't have any condoms and I'm not having sex with you without protection, or, hey, I can't find my friends, they're looking for me, I have an early day tomorrow. So again, it's kind of these non-confrontational thanks but no thanks responses. But what happens when those responses don't work? What happens when then the situation becomes violent or it becomes traumatic? And that's when the fight, flight, or freeze part of the cascade kicks in. So we're first going to talk about freeze. So oftentimes when people talk about freeze, we always think of like a deer in headlights, right? Like they just stand there staring at the car, they don't move. Well, that is a freeze response, but they're also just blinded by the car and not sure what to do. So instead, I want to talk about a rabbit. So I think hopefully we've all been out in enough nature that we've encountered a rabbit while on a walk in a park or something. And what typically happens is you come across a rabbit, runs out of a bush, and it sees you and it freezes. It stops moving, but oftentimes you can see its little like ears twitching, kind of assessing for the different noises, its nose twitching and whiskers twitching, and then a couple things might happen. It might run back under the bush, might run away, it might attack you, or it might stay frozen until you pass by it. So this is that freeze response. Every single one of us, when we encounter a traumatic event or a threat, we have an initial freeze response. So we freeze, and just like that rabbit's ears are twitching, its whiskers are moving, it's assessing the situation, and then it will either mobilize into fight or flight, or freeze will continue. And when freeze continues, we fall into possibly two different categories or types of freeze, and that's tonic and collapsed immobility. So when we're talking about tonic immobility, this is often, and I do want to say this is not, we just because somebody may say they froze or they couldn't move or they felt paralyzed, we can't tell them with certainty that they experienced tonic immobility or collapsed immobility, but it does give us some insight. Tonic immobility is a sense of paralysis or that sense of freezing. So it's a lot of like tensing up. The muscles are tense. The heart rate kind of increases, breathing rates may increase, but people feel like they can't move. They're paralyzed by their tense muscles. That's tonic immobility. It's usually onset at the point of touch. So not like when you're at the bar and somebody touches your arm, like, hey, do you want to come home with me? No, but maybe at that point when the brain realizes this is not okay and this is happening to me. So maybe that point of penetration, that the body tenses up and freezes. Up to 70% of survivors actually experience tonic immobility during sexual assault. So again, they feel frozen, they feel paralyzed. And that can have a really significant effect on self-blame later on. Additionally, when we're talking about tonic immobility, the onset of tonic immobility and return to homeostasis, I'm using that word with discretion. The body's not going to a completely normal state, essentially coming out of that sense of freezing is pretty quick. So somebody can freeze up and then pretty quickly they gain their mobility back once they're coming out of it. So again, tonic immobility has that sense of muscle tension, increased heart rate, increased respiration rate, pupils may dilate, etc. And then there's also collapsed immobility. So collapsed immobility, a survivor may describe it as, I just felt like a rag doll. They went limp. They kind of lost all their muscle tone. So it's the opposite end of the spectrum of tonic immobility. So they go limp. Sometimes they may lose consciousness as well. And this is also completely going limp, and then also kind of the respiration rate decreases, the heart rate decreases. So it's, again, the opposite of tonic immobility. It's more of a loss of consciousness versus a tensing up. And in contrast to tonic immobility, the onset and I don't know a better term for this, but return or coming out of it, return to homeostasis is pretty slow. So it takes a little bit longer for somebody to gain their normal functioning back. And I did mention that this can include loss of consciousness. It doesn't have to. So somebody may not lose consciousness. That doesn't mean they didn't experience collapsed immobility. And so I'm going to show a video, and I'm going to do a full disclosure. It does involve animals. So if you do not want to watch the video because of the involvement of animals, please feel free to step away for a minute, refresh your coffee. I'll announce when the video has ended, but full disclosure, there is no harm done. It may look like it at first, but there's no harm done to either animal in this. There's no blood, there's no gore. So I'm going to play this, and then I just want you to pay attention, and I'll kind of talk over the video a little bit here, but there's no dialogue. Pay attention to the muscle tone, the breathing, and how the impala here comes out of collapsed immobility. So you'll notice here that the impala's head kind of flops to the side. There's no muscle tone. There's no control of the neck or the head. if you also look closely, there's no blinking taking place. And we watch for breathing as well. It doesn't appear that there's any breathing taking place, any inhales or exhales. And then again, about 15 seconds later, we start to see this intake of breath and kind of the slowly regaining of the muscle tone, the breathing. Um, give it a second here. So you'll see as it's trying to regain its control over its muscles, it's taking some time. It's obviously shaking. Then after some time, it is able to run away. So I'm going to stop the video. For those of you that stepped away or may have kind of looked away from your screen and looked at your phone, the video is over. But I do like to show that video because not just for like shock effect or shock value, but to demonstrate that there's a reason that this is an evolutionary response that happens today in the animal kingdom, and it's a mechanism for survival. And I will say that, again, just like with the oxytocin component, when I first started looking into neurobiology of trauma, I was like, why? I mean, why would you play dead? Why would we play dead as a survival response? I couldn't grasp it. And I grew up in little bit of Pennsylvania, a little bit of a rural area. And I always thought about possums. I was like, how is that an effective defense mechanism? Doesn't it just make you easier prey? And so I really had to think about this and look into it a little bit further. And I guess I'm going to go into a little bit. I want, if anyone, just think about it while we dive into some other responses in the animal kingdom. But think about why it may be a beneficial survival mechanism to quote unquote play dead or engage in collapsed immobility. But while you're thinking about that, I want to go over a couple other examples of these neurobiological or behavioral based response to trauma in the animal kingdom. So when we're talking about tonic immobility, sharks, they engage in tonic immobility, which I find fascinating because they are like an apex predator. But apparently, I don't know who did this first, but apparently, if you dive down, as you can see on your screen, you can put a shark in tonic immobility. You can rub the bottom of their chin and they will actually freeze up, tense up, and float nose down, as you can see on your screen. And this is an evolutionary response. And actually, killer whales have learned this to the point where they will purposely put sharks into tonic immobility states so that they can prey on them. So I find that fascinating. Also, chickens. I don't know who's familiar with chickens. Again, I grew up in Pennsylvania, but a chicken, its legs will go straight out. It'll tense up if you try and capture it or scare it. We also have fainting goats. So fainting goats, they get scared. Again, they tense up. You see videos that are very amusing where people like open an umbrella around them and they just fall over, like you see here. That's going into a sense of tonic immobility. And then for collapsed immobility, hognose snakes, they'll curl up and play dead. And I think they release an odor of death, decay as well as a deterrent. Possums didn't show the full commercial, but because I can't necessarily say I support Geico, but that is one of my favorite Geico commercials. Possums will play dead as well. And as we saw, so will impalas. And then, of course, we have humans that will engage in both of these types of defense mechanisms. If you haven't seen slingshot videos on YouTube, I recommend you Google them. They're very amusing, where people just simply lose consciousness, go limp, essentially collapsed immobility. Now, I've had arguments that that's not a collapsed immobility, that's an effective G forces or whatever, but it's still an amusing video to watch. But we do engage in both tonic and collapsed immobility. So does anyone have any thoughts on why these are effective defense mechanisms? Because again, when I was thinking about it, I didn't understand why defense mechanism like collapsed immobility or even tonic immobility would be beneficial and why we would have maintained that throughout evolution. Yes. So, Victoria, great. Predators have the instinct to not consume dead prey as there may be an illness or contamination. Um, so I didn't think about that. Reduce blood flow, reduce blood loss. That's a good point as well. But to Victoria's point, I always think about how there's so many recalls these days, but how many people, when Chipotle had their contamination, everybody stopped going to Chipotle for a while. But and that's because we didn't want to eat contaminated food, didn't want to get ill, didn't want to end up in the hospital, potentially pass away from that contamination. And then, of course, everybody started going back to Chipotle again, and then they had the contamination of the lettuce, and then we stopped going all over again. So it can be a cycle, and that is ingrained with us. We avoid dead prey because it can possibly harm us as well. And then we're also seeing other input. I love the idea of reduced blood flow reduces blood loss for injuries. And there's also the theory of, predators that prey and enjoy essentially the game. So losing that could also be them becoming disinterested could become a means of survival for us as well. So those are all great input. And then I'm just going to touch on disassociation. So disassociation or faint or fawn are other terms that you may hear for this is when we or the survivor, the individual enters enters a state of dissociation. So this is when we feel disconnected from our body. So a lot of people may describe it as like watching a movie about what's happening to them or floating above or outside of their body and observing what happened to them instead of actually feeling like they're experiencing it. So this is again a feeling, a sense of a response to trauma. Part of this may also include entering into an autopilot mode as self-protection. So this may be something somebody does when we hear stories of like the survivor engaged in the behaviors that the perpetrator told them to do. So the perpetrator gave them instructions and they followed through and engaged in those activities. And that may appear like, oh, they were consenting or they going along with it. But a sense of autopilot or engaging in those things also can be a way of self-protection. So it may be that we've assessed that if we don't engage in those activities or enter that autopilot mode, we're in more danger. We're more likely to be harmed by this individual. So to quote unquote go along with it can be more beneficial. And that's when we're talking about the fawn response. And I think that that's really important because I think, again, that's going to be a point where survivors often blame themselves. Why did I go along with it? Why did I do what he told me to do? And again, we can explain it as a means of survival. And I think it's really important to be able to explain that to survivors. And I think it's also really important for us as service providers to still encourage survivors to get a sexual assault forensic exam or report to the police if they are comfortable with doing that. Because what they still experienced was traumatic event and should not have happened. So I think that there's been plenty of cases where survivors enter that autopilot, do as they're told, but we're still able to collect evidence through a forensic exam and hold offenders accountable. So those things are still very important. I'm going to show another video. I'm going to mute it as fast as I can, but it's very loud. So if your volume is up, the music is really loud, but I'm going to mute it. It is another animal video. So again, no animal gets harmed. It's a cat and a mouse. Neither will be harmed. But if you want to step away, you're not comfortable with that, please feel free to do so, and I'll announce when the video is over. Oh, it's already muted. Okay. So I'm going to talk through this a little bit. This video is meant to just demonstrate that the defense cascade is a cascade. So there's not a one response and done. So as you're looking at this mouse, you can't see it breathing. You can't see there doesn't seem to be muscle tone. The cat's able to kind of bite at it, push it around, and it's collapsed. Now, as we're seeing, it's starting to gain muscle tone. Its breathing has become rapid, just like we saw with the impala, but it's still not moving. So again, we're coming out of, we're assuming, collapsed immobility. And then for whatever reason, it enters into a fight mode. So after coming out of that collapsed immobility or immobility in general, it then engages in the fight defense mechanism. And apparently if there's longer versions of the video, but then the mouse runs out of the room. So then it shifts into a flee response. So the purpose of that video is to demonstrate that, again, there's a cascade. It's not like one and done. You can fight and then you could enter into collapsed immobility or tonic immobility, vice versa. So it's a cascade and various responses can occur. So there's some consequences. While these responses are evolutionarily ingrained in us and they're meant to increase our survival, there are consequences. And I think some of you put some of that in the chat earlier, but survivors often experience self-blame and doubt after if they freeze or they don't do what they feel they should have done. So they didn't fight, they didn't run, but they experience an immobility or dissociation. They're also less likely to report because they feel less likely to be believed, or again, they're blaming themselves for what happened. And there are studies that specifically link tonic immobility and those that experience tonic immobility during a traumatic event and the eventual development of depression and PTSD. So again, the reason I show these animal videos, they're slightly amusing, at least to me, and they offer some lightheartedness to this. Well, not the impala one, but they offer some lightheartedness. I do think there's a purpose. And I think that when we can explain to survivors that what happened and the way they responded is not their fault. It wasn't a choice. It's something that we have ingrained in us for survival. It can help them come to terms and maybe reduce the amount of blame that they place on themselves. And I think that's something we see a lot. I have a case where the survivor was raped by a stranger in the 1990s. And one of the first things she said to me was, well, it's my fault I didn't lock my door. So I think that even those things as simple as that, when we can explain that that's not their fault and the behavior they engaged in is not their fault at all, and it does not give anyone permission to violate them in any way just because they freeze or they don't fight or flee. It doesn't give anyone permission to violate them and commit a crime. And I think that can be very powerful. So the last thing about the brain that I'm going to cover is understanding some of the brain activity. So while all this is happening, again, our prefrontal cortex is shutting down. Our body's flooding with survival stress hormones, and we may be engaging in fight, flight, or freeze. There's also some things that are happening to the way we pay attention to our surrounding information and the way we assess that information to determine threat. And so I'm just going to talk about brain activity and our attention and focus. So there's two types of brain activity, and the first is top-down attention. So top-down attention is when your prefrontal cortex is like, again, performing at its peak. Your top-down attention, you're able to focus on your goals, the steps that you need to take to achieve those goals. You're focusing on what you want as an individual, your internal desires, and you're able to plan out the steps to reach those desires. So that's top-down attention. But bottom-up attention is when we're reversing that, and it becomes essentially all about survival. It's based on survival, and it's determined by our fear. So instead of focusing on, the goals and the executive functioning steps, if this, then that, we're solely focused on external factors, raw sensory input, and it's really involuntary. So this is when sometimes the reason I have the photo of the gun here is because somebody may be mugged and law enforcement or somebody goes, well, what did they look like? And they have no idea. They can't describe it. The person's face, they have no recollection of it, but they know for a fact that they had a gun, and maybe they even know what type of gun the person had. And that's because when the brain is engaging in bottom-up attention, it's focusing on what is the most threatening to an individual. So in that moment, it was a gun. And so everything else is kind of blurred out and not retained. And we're focusing on where is the gun being pointed? What is he doing with the gun? And so that's our bottom-up attention. We're focusing on the very base desire of survival, and that's where we're keeping all of our focus versus all of these moving pieces. Now, where we get into the details of sexual assault is oftentimes there's not a weapon involved in sexual assault. So then we get to what we were talking about earlier in terms of super encoding and minimal encoding is somebody may, disassociate during a sexual assault and again focus on a picture in the room. And they can perfectly recall that picture. That's bottom-up attention. Even though it may not be a threat to them, it's not like a gun, but that is what the brain focused on. They disassociated, and that's the component that their brain remembered. And the other details, the peripheral details, are not ingrained as clearly. In contrast, I also like to talk about the difference in brain activity for a perpetrator versus the victim or survivor. So when we're talking about perpetrators, they're not stressed in the same way. I'm not going to say I wouldn't, they're not stressed to the level of like their survival of being threatened. They may be worried about getting caught, but generally speaking, they're not stressed. Their prefrontal cortex is in control. They have the ability to plan, to think things through, and they're reasonable. They have the ability to, if this, then that. So the picture on your screen is actually of Ed Kemper. If you're not familiar with him, I do think this is the perfect case to describe the way a perpetrator's brain is working compared to a survivor's. In this case, Ed Kemper, he was like almost, I think, 6'8" or something, very, very tall, large man. And he wanted to be a police officer. And back then, they actually told him he was too big to be a police officer. So he wasn't. But he still went to the local bar where all the police officers hung out after their shifts, etc. And they would chat about what they were dealing with at work. And when Ed Kemper started his killing spree, he still went to that bar and he still talked to the police officers and the detectives about this case. And he would gather information from them and what maybe they'd be honing in on or narrowing down on to try and locate this guy. And then he would change his tactics so as to throw them off. He was so good at this. He was not demonstrating any stress. He was planning things through. He was able to take that information and shift his behaviors accordingly. So his brain functioning was at a high level. It was at a peak performance. But in contrast, the survivors are overwhelmed. They're fearful. They're unable to plan because the prefrontal cortex is being interrupted, and all of their actions, that bottom-up attention, is taking over. So their actions are being driven by what the perpetrator is doing, and their attention is focused on what the perpetrator is doing. So we have very different types of brain activity happening between perpetrators and survivors. Now that we're wrapping up kind of the what's happening in the brain and the different responses behaviorally to trauma, I want to talk about secondary victimization. So this picture is meant to demonstrate that after something like a sexual assault, a survivor is moving through a system where just, one person after another is encountering the survivor and they're retelling their story and they're reliving everything. So if you're looking at the right of your screen, I'm assuming that may be a perpetrator, and then you're moving on to the patrol, and the patrol officer brings in the detective, and then next we're moving on to another detective, and then a doctor for an exam, and then a lawyer, and then a judge. It is a never-ending, well, it ends, but it's a constant stream of encountering somebody different, of telling your story all over again. And this is something I think is really important to keep in mind, because I don't think anyone in the system, any first responder, whether an advocate, patrol, detective, judge, nurse, I don't think anyone wants to re-traumatize that victim or cause secondary victimization. But the nature of the system is re-traumatizing. We cannot avoid it. And I think that's something that we need to carry with us. If somebody's having an exam, well, the nature of the exam is invasive. We have to possibly do speculum insertions, swabbing of very private areas, taking photos while somebody's, completely stripped down and injured. That is terrifying and re-traumatizing. It's the nature of the job. So when we can offer trauma-informed and victim-centered care and mitigate that re-traumatization, it's important to do that for the survivor. And it may be something as simply as explaining what you're doing and why. Why are you asking this type of question? Why are you asking them to retell their story again? Why are we doing photographs? We can go through that. And if we can provide them with a reason that they can understand, it may just help mitigate things a little bit for them. So it's important to remember, just because you don't want to re-traumatize and that's not your goal, doesn't mean what the survivor is going through isn't re-traumatizing. So you could have all the best intentions in the world, but recognizing that the system in and of itself is re-traumatizing and keeping that in mind when you're working with survivors is really important, in my opinion. And there's also a quote that I will give, a quote that a survivor said, that when describing the system that she went through and moving through the process, or the criminal justice process, it was stated that it's as if the rape weren't bad enough. I had to go through everything that I did with the police and the doctors. It's just more rape. The rape just keeps on and on, like you just can't escape it. So it's constantly those invasive questions and reliving it. So again, keeping that in mind. So what we can do when working with the survivors in a simply, system that by nature is re-traumatizing, we can engage in that trauma-informed service. So I'm going to wrap up today with the principles of trauma-informed care. Before I do that, I really wish that I always had fun with this part of the presentation during in-person trainings. But so instead of doing small group exercises, I'm just going to ask you each to take a moment and think about the best sexual experience you've had in your life. So how old were you? Who was your partner? Were they same sex, different sex? Had you been under the influence, drugs, alcohol? Was there any kink involved? Like, what are we talking about? And when you're thinking about that experience, I want you to put in the chat, if you're comfortable, who you would be comfortable sharing that story with. And I mean the whole story, all of those details I just went over. Is there anyone that you would be comfortable sharing that information with? And if no, put that there's no one that you would be comfortable sharing that in the chat. So I'll give it a second. Sister, okay. Your partner. Can you repeat the question, please? Okay, so I want you to take a moment and think about your best sexual experience, all the details. So who was the partner? How old were you? How old were they? Were you guys under the influence? Was there any kink involved? Did any kind of those details of your best sexual experience, and who would you be comfortable sharing that with, if anyone? So I'm seeing a lot of best friend, partner, sister. As a sister, I don't want to know. Probably no one in full detail. Great, thank you. Yeah, so the comment about being a sister, you don't want to know. This reminds me, I gave this presentation in person once before COVID, and this older gentleman was sitting next to a younger woman. And when I asked this question, he raised his hand immediately and was like, "I'm willing to share with the group." And I was like, okay, well, no, that I actually I know I said that, but I was joking. I don't want anyone to share. And the woman next to him, I just saw her take a big sigh of relief. And then later she came up to me and she was like, "That's my dad. I did not need to know." So I'm seeing some more feedback. Best friend. I have shared with friends. Yeah. If you ever decided, yeah, and best friend, if you ever decided, so on. So the reason I ask this is it's a good thought-provoking question, but also then I want you to flip it. None of you said a stranger. None of you said, I'm gonna walk up to somebody on the street and go through all those details. And yet it's your best sexual experience. So it's supposed to be positive for you. So it's a positive thing to share. So, but we're still not willing to share with strangers. And yet when we're working with survivors, we are often asking them to tell us the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Not just like a bad sexual experience. We're asking them to tell us a terrifying thing, and we're asking them to tell us all the details. How much did you have to drink? How much did he have to drink? Did he strangle you? Did you lose consciousness? Did you lose control of your bladder or your bowels? Did you have an orgasm? Did he have an orgasm? Whatever it may be, we're asking as strangers all those details. And like you just saw in that picture, it's a line of people that are just asking it over and over again. So every time you sit down with a survivor, whatever capacity that's in, an advocate, law enforcement, nurse, attorney, I want you to keep that in mind, that you are asking them to tell you the worst thing that's ever happened to them, and they don't know anything about you and you know nothing about them. It's terrifying. So whatever you can do, again, to mitigate that, we should try and do. And we can do that with trauma-informed services. So the 6 core principles of trauma-informed services is safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, empowerment, voice and choice, collaboration, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So we can all incorporate some of these things into our work. So it can be something as simple as being transparent about why, again, you're asking a certain question, why you're asking them to tell their story when they've already told it to patrol and a detective. And they already told it at triage when they came into the hospital. Why are we now asking them as a forensic nurse? We can also empower them to make the choices that are best for them. So that's also when we're looking at like the SAKI presentation I gave on Wednesday, or something about like the care. I don't know if there's any forensic nurses on this call, but when a survivor goes through a forensic exam, they have choice. So they can consent to parts of the exam, they can consent to all of the exam, they can consent to none of it. So giving them the choice on what they want and how they want to move forward is really helpful. I always give an example about choice and safety. Is before I worked at MCASA, I worked at a transitional home for female felons that were being released back into the community and they needed time to adjust. And before that, I had worked at the Fairfax County Public Defender's Office. Please don't judge me, but working at the public defender's office, when I went into the jail to sit with defendants, there was very specific rules. I always had to sit at the chair closest to the door, different requirements. There was an alarm bell so that I could hit it if I needed to exit the interview room quickly, etc. And so when I then moved on to this transitional home and I had an office, I set up my office, and where do you think I put my desk and my chair? I put it by the door. And I had my client sit at the other end by the window away from the door. And that just seemed natural to me. But I started to notice that people weren't opening up. They didn't seem comfortable. They were tense. And eventually I came to the realization that they were just incarcerated, and that's what was required of them. They didn't have access to leave rooms when they wanted to. There was always a guard in their way. They didn't feel safe. And so then I started shifting to, instead of having a designated spot for me and a designated spot for the client, I would say, pick where you would want to sit down. And almost every single time they sat closest to the door. That's a safety thing, and that's a choice. It gives them control over the situation. So these are all types of trauma-informed things we can carry into our work. The other thing I'll note in relation to cultural, historical, and gender issues is we don't necessarily have to know everything, but we can acknowledge what we don't know and apologize when we make mistakes. So again, talking about that job I had with the female transitional home, I had a client that very much presented gender neutral and preferred not to have female pronouns used. Well, the entire program was staffed by females and all clients were females. And so it was very hard for me, and I'm just being honest, to shift from saying she and her to them and they. And so what I had to do just off the bat was acknowledge with them that I may make a mistake. And if I make a mistake, I want you to feel comfortable telling me that, and I'll own up to it. And I promise I'm not doing it purposely. And that in and of itself, acknowledging that I may not be perfect, it really helped with our dynamic and and their understanding that, it wasn't an intentional thing. I wasn't trying to harm them. And it also gave them power to speak up for themselves when I did do something wrong. So those things can go a long way. And then I'm actually under 2 hours. So I will close by some general service providers' do's and don'ts. So just understand that there's no perfect or typical victim. Somebody may be devastated, crying, hysterical. Somebody else may have a flat affect. They may be numb. Somebody else may be laughing or joking or show no symptoms of or traditional symptoms of trauma. And that's perfectly normal. Also recognize that not remembering all the details of an assault is perfectly normal. It can be hard to recall information. And sometimes somebody may remember something further down the line. And instead of questioning, well, why didn't you remember that when I asked you? We need to think about why that memory may be coming forward now. Is it because they've had a cycle of sleep? Is it because we asked a question about, what do you remember feeling in that moment? So I always give an example to law enforcement. Somebody may say, like, I felt trapped. And then instead of asking, like, well, then what next? Ask for, like, can you describe to me how you felt trapped? This is going to help provide a lot of detail that could be really important for an investigation. Well, he had pushed me down on the bed and against the wall, and he was standing over me. I felt like I just couldn't even get away if I wanted to. So now we can put that information together, and we're creating more of an understanding of what happened just by asking, what do you mean when you say you felt trapped? So we can use our neurobiology of trauma understanding to help people recall information when they don't already remember it. And some don'ts are to do not ask survivors why they didn't ask more rationally. I mean, I hope everyone has that understanding, but why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you yell? Those are all things that I'm sure the survivor is asking themselves anyway. They don't know. And quite frankly, they don't have to answer that because whatever survival mechanism kicked in when they were experiencing that threat, that's what kicked in. And it was their evolutionary response to the threat. And then I also say, this isn't on the screen, but remove why from your vocabulary as much as you can. I guarantee you, if you can think of a why question right now, it could be perceived as victim blaming. Why were you drinking? Why did you wear that skirt? Why did you do this? Those may be questions that we need answers to, but if we can reframe them and remove why, it can help reduce some of the victim blaming's component. Additionally, I also understand that sometimes we can't remove why. So if we can explain why we're asking the question, that can be helpful. So why were you drinking? Why did you do this? If we're explaining the reasoning behind it, it can be beneficial. So not a why question, but the example I always give is sometimes we have to ask, what were you wearing? And survivors may get really defensive about that because they feel like, oh, well, are you saying that because I was wearing a skirt, I was asking for it? But if we reframe that and say, from the perspective of, say, law enforcement, can you tell me what you were wearing when this happened? Because I have this inventory list from the nurse of what was collected when you had your exam at the hospital. And I just want to make sure we've gathered all the evidence that we need. You're explaining why, you're getting the information you need, and it doesn't sound victim blaming. So it can be really helpful. And then do not expect survivors to be able to relate what happened in chronological order. Just like don't ask survivors or don't, it's perfectly normal for them to not be able to remember everything. So important takeaways, trauma-informed care allows us to benefit both the survivor and us as service providers, whatever our role is. So it's mutually beneficial. It helps reduces that secondary re-victimization or secondary victimization and re-traumatization, and allows us to do our job more effectively, whatever that job is. So collecting evidence as a nurse, being an advocate, support person, investigating, whatever it is, when we're trauma-informed, we can do that job better. And I think that is it with questions. So if anyone has any questions and wants to put them in the chat, I'm also very much welcome and open to people unmuting themselves. Oh, shoot. You are welcome to do that. That is my contact information. So if you have questions about neuro or really anything, SAKI from the previous day, I'd be happy to correspond via email. And I think Alyssa put the evaluation link in the chat. So if you can fill that out, I would greatly appreciate it. So I'm ending 10 minutes early. Sorry, I was aiming for a little bit earlier, but I hope everyone has a good Friday, and hopefully everyone's getting to enjoy the 3-day weekend.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for that great presentation. As Laura said, I put the evaluation link into the chat, so we greatly appreciate all feedback. If you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. If you click on that link, you'll be able to access the certificate request form. I'll be sending a follow-up email later today with a copy of the video recording, the evaluation link, and the PowerPoint slides used in today's presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free if you want to stay on for a couple of minutes, or you can email Laura after the follow-up email. We hope to see you on Tuesday, and thank you again for joining us today.